We're excited to have with us tonight Jonathan Stapley, the author of this fine new book from Oxford University Press, The Power of Godliness, Mormon Liturgy and Cosmology. And there's a couple of you here. I want you to know that cosmology is not astrology, because you're asking about a sign and stuff. And so just wanted you to know that's different. I was telling Jonathan earlier that I was giving a lesson in high priests, and I was talking about temple ritual and used that word a couple of times, and one of my friends in the high priest group came up after. He says, no, he didn't come up after. He raised his hand and said, what's this ritual thing? I don't like that word. Why do you use that? So I think you're going to hear it a little bit tonight, so don't get upset. But this was the same guy that borrowed my priesthood manual to teach a lesson and highlighted it and wrote notes through the whole thing in my copy, then gave it back to me. So that tells you something about him. Our next signing will be on March 21st. Another Oxford title, Foundational Texts of Mormonism, Critical Studies of Major Sources in Early Mormon History, edited by Robin Jensen, Mark Ashurst McGee, and Sherilyn Howcroft. So we're excited about that, and then we're always planning more of these, and we try to have one or two a month. So if you're not on our mailing list, please get on there so that you can be notified via email when we do these events, because we choose these people very carefully, and then depending on the payment I get from them, we promote it and so on. Jonathan, I do need to talk to you about that. Okay. So this is something we actually really enjoy doing. It's a highlight, and I know a lot of you feel that same way, and many of you come to all or most of these, which we really appreciate, and we hope those of you who have just come for the first time will keep coming and use our new bags. I'm going to not talk a lot about the book, because actually that's what he came to talk about. But I did want to read an endorsement by Jill Mulvey-Durr about this wonderful new book. I've just barely started to get into it myself. We just barely got them. And the more I talked to Jonathan this evening about the book, the more excited I got to read it, because I was learning things right and left. He knows his subject like no other. Jill said, "This imaginative and impeccably documented inquiry into the Mormon ordering of cosmos and community probes the connection between liturgical and ecclesiastical structures and casts new light on both. Drawing upon his prodigious research in personal narratives and institutional sources that span decades of Mormon history, Stapley demonstrates how successive changes in Mormon rituals have affected the beliefs and experiences of ordinary men and women. The book's detailed and even-handed treatment of such complicated and contested issues as shifting conceptualization of priesthood and women's long-time participation in healing rituals makes it a fascinating read, a valuable reference, and a helpful bridge between the Mormonism of the present and its all-too-distant past." There's some other great endorsements on there as well. I'm very impressed with the book, and I'm anxious to finish reading it. I was going to point out one other, Jonathan has published in a number of publications, but particularly, I think, Journal of Mormon History, and in this winter 2011 issue, a groundbreaking article called Female Ritual Healing in Mormonism. Highly recommend that. And a lot of times I'm introducing authors and speakers here, and I've known them for many years and consider them longtime friends. I just met Jonathan today for the first time, but I'm very impressed, and I'm anxious to hear from him tonight. And I'm grateful that he's joined Benchmark Books in our ongoing series of these events that we're really happy happy to bring to you. Thank you so much for coming. And I'll turn the time over to Jonathan. A noisemaker.
All right, can you hear me? Can you be closer?
Yeah, I think a little closer.
How about now?
Mm-hmm.
Good?
Good. Do you need this? Or?
No, I don't. Before we start, I just want to make a quick correction. So that article in the Journal of Mormon History on female ritual healing was the culmination of 3 articles that I wrote with Chris Wright, who's now at Princeton.
That. I'm sorry.
And that really was my entree into Mormon historical writing, and I'm deeply grateful for my collaboration and friendship with Chris, without whom none of this would have been possible. In fact, there's people in this room that also fall into that category. So Artis is here. Gary gave me one of the documents that I'm going to be talking about tonight. So as with many aspects of writing and researching, a given work is a culmination of effort of a community as much as it is of an individual. So thank you for coming out. I'm grateful to be discussing this topic today, and I hope that we can have a discussion that is worth your time and effort to be here. So in 1889, Louisa Fanny Newman was 23 years old, and she was actually living in North Utah County, Alpine, Lehigh area. It was before Adobe was there, so it was a little bit different. She was pregnant, and things weren't exactly like she hoped. See, 3 years earlier, she had married Cyrus Gold, but she was not the first wife, and she was consequently on the underground. She was hiding to avoid subpoena and the prosecution of her husband for unlawful cohabitation. Yet, she wanted a community. She wanted to deliver her baby safely. She wanted a blessing. Now, at this time, Zina D.H. Young was the General Relief Society president in the church, and as part of a broader leadership tour of the region, she stopped in Lehigh and Alpine, and every day that she was there, she blessed dozens of people. She ministered to people with fits or paralysis, the sick and the afflicted, and to several women like Louisa Fanny Newman who were pregnant. She consequently anointed and sealed blessings upon Louisa and her unborn child. Now, it's stories like this that are the reason my book exists, because as a young researcher and scholar of Mormonism, I couldn't understand how this fit within my tradition. I didn't know how to imagine its possibility. Not only was the practice of a woman, a General Relief Society president, blessing the sick beyond my personal memory, but so too were the rituals that she used in her ministry. And so began a long process, over a decade, of research and writing that I hope can cast events such as this in ways that are comprehensible. That they not only are deeply Mormon to the modern reader, but also deeply moving. So in this book, I talk about liturgy, and that's a word that Mormons don't use very often. So what is liturgy? If you're a Roman Catholic or Orthodox or Jewish, this is a term that you're familiar with from within your tradition. It's essentially the system of ritualized acts and rituals and ceremonies that believers engage in to celebrate, worship, and mark life events and regular worship. So why is that important? Well, the words that we use as Latter-day Saints today have over the years developed particular and peculiar definitions that resonate within the community but don't communicate that same meaning to outsiders, ordinances being one of them. But also within the history of Mormonism, the words that we use have changed and developed meanings that are not recognizable to the modern reader. And so I approach, I'm just going to go through the various chapters of the book. There's only 5. I'll highlight aspects of it that may shed light onto the project as a whole. So chapter 1 is about ordination. And what I think is the most important aspect of the chapter is the introduction of an idea that frames the 19th century use of the term priesthood and the temple liturgy. So, while priests and high priests were ordained in the early church in Nauvoo, a whirlpool of tributaries came together in the Nauvoo temple liturgy and associated cosmology that was a radical expansion. Salvation, government, kinship, and priesthood became synonymous. And I know that's kind of hard to wrap your head around, but just stay with me. In the temple, as relationships were sealed and made formal, heaven was materialized. Just as the Catholic priest stands before the altar and materializes the flesh of Christ, so too the Mormon priest stands at the altar and materializes heaven in the relationships that he creates. So heaven is no longer something that is an award for faith. It is no longer the gift of God to the elect, as in other traditions. Heaven is something that is created and made in the temple, and when you leave, that's it. And the participants, the male and female participants in the Nauvoo temple liturgy during Joseph Smith's life, referred to each other as the priesthood, the holy priesthood, the quorum of the priesthood, the quorum. And so as outsiders, as we all are, approached the historical sources and saw a woman or a man describe meeting with men and women of the people that participated in the temple and referred to it, say, I met with the priesthood today. What does that even mean? And it has been a challenge to believers and scholars alike to understand what this priesthood is. Is it the priesthood that we think of today? And my argument is that no, it is not. This heaven, this materialized network of relationality, that is a priesthood, and I use essentially a heuristic device. I call it the Cosmological Priesthood. I know it's idiosyncratic and kind of lame. But that's what I'm rolling with, so you have to roll with me. The Cosmological Priesthood. And what does creating this heuristic device allow us to do? It allows us to interpret the words and actions of 19th century Mormons, and particularly the locus of the Nauvoo experience, in ways that are comprehensible. The restriction of the priesthood and temple liturgy to non-black Africans. That doesn't make sense to us today, but the narrative which Brigham Young created to justify it in 1849, as it is first documented and then repeated throughout his lifetime, centers on the cosmological priesthood. such that the slaying of Abel by Cain was not a fratricidal act. He did not merely kill his brother, but he fractured the cosmos. You see, Abel was supposed to be a node in this network. And by slaying Abel, he broke off that part of heaven. And so the consequence was Cain's curse, or consequence, was that he too was to be fractured until Abel was somehow miraculously restored. And as repugnant as it is to us today, that such a restriction would be in place, it's at least, the justification for its genesis is at least understandable. I think we should be wary of any claim that we do not know why it happened. We do. But it requires a different framework to understand and to make any sense at all. And as the declension of the cosmological priesthood became effectual in the turn of the 20th century, that was just a garble of long words. Over time, the cosmological priesthood is no longer used to interpret the temple. We don't use that framework after the death of several church presidents. And in the 20th century, new ways of looking at the temple and priesthood arise. And in the case of the temple and priesthood restriction, again, the ecclesiastical priesthood restriction is merely a consequence, ramification of the broader cosmological priesthood restriction. That when the declension of the cosmological priesthood is in effect, people have to invent new stories. It was because they were less valiant, or they were fence-sitters, or something that's comprehensible. And those become the rationales by which the restriction is based. In that chapter, there's discussion of the essentiality of women to the cosmological priesthood. It requires women to exist, and men, because it's relational, and over 50% of the population is female. In the 20th century, as an ascendant priesthood cosmology that was rooted in ecclesiology, the offices of the church is created and then expanded. The restriction of female from the priesthood is required for coherence. And then the struggle results of how to integrate women into the cosmology of the church. And it's, we are living today the interesting and fascinating engagement of the highest church leaders on this topic. So hopefully, if you read it, you'll be able to contextualize not only the past, but also the present. Let's skip to chapter 3, which is about baby blessings, which doesn't seem necessarily obvious as a source of analysis for Mormon worldview, but I believe that it is. In 1857, Heber C. Kimball stood up. He's a counselor to Brigham Young in the first presidency. And he says, "I am preaching to my brethren and sisters that they may know, if they have not dedicated and consecrated their children to the Lord, that it has to be done. But you may inquire, how shall we do it? You will have to do it as Brother Brigham and others have done when in Nauvoo. We had to take our children and wash and anoint them and place the birthright and Father's blessing upon them in the house of God, and then you have them sealed to us, and you will have to do just so." What? So you have to understand first that while there were thousands of people that were endowed in the Nauvoo temple, and over 1,000 people, over 1,000 sealings that were performed in marriage, less than 100 child-to-parent sealings were performed in the Nauvoo temple. There simply was not time. Now, you couple that with the idea that in the 19th century, you could not be sealed to someone that was not a member of the church. Okay? You have to bracket your lived experience for a second. If you were a convert, your parents were not Mormon, and they died, you could be baptized by proxy for them, but you could not be sealed to them in the temple, because sealings were only between believing Latter-day Saints. And at this time, the only ritual in the temple liturgy that was restricted to temples was child-to-parent sealings. Brigham Young called it the highest ordinance of the church, which is interesting. So what do we have? Gary kindly forwarded me a link to the church's digitized collection of John Taylor, which included this fascinating blessing, which is a record of the practice described by Heber C. Kimball here. For those few families that were able to seal their children to them in Nauvoo, they took their children, and other people describe this. There are examples of short descriptions, but this blessing in the John Taylor collection is just marvelous. Leonora Taylor and John Taylor took their children to the temple. They dressed them in white. They washed and anointed them preparatory to the sealing, and they pronounced blessings upon them, essentially a recasting of the baby blessing, in which they describe how the child will become part of the priesthood, the cosmological priesthood, and how they will receive the full blessings of the covenant. What is fascinating is that some years later, their first child, after being sealed, they bless, according to tradition, at 8 days. So 8th day blessings was the common practice for newborns. John Taylor writes the blessing down, and it's very similar to the blessing he has for the blessing of the temple, except it isn't in preparation for. It's a blessing of what this neonate already has. So it becomes a declaration, an enunciation of the child's place in the cosmological priesthood, because he was born to a family that was sealed together. Baby blessings announce many things. They announce, as this, the place in the cosmological priesthood during this window, where it is the normative framework for understanding Mormon cosmology. Later on, it becomes the job of a father. Now, John Taylor was a person of high ecclesiastical office. For the vast majority of the saints of the 19th century, babies were blessed by their bishops, or a bishop, or an acting bishop. So of the thousands of babies blessed, only a small fraction were blessed by their fathers, and in those cases it was generally a Brigham Young or a church hierarch. For the most people, you took your child to church, and as the Articles and Covenants state, they are blessed by the elders of the church. But in the and there's this tension, right? Well, and 8-day blessing, it's hard to get the bishop to come on 8th day. It's hard. And so John Taylor says, well, you know, he was kind of a textual fundamentalist. He decided to pare down Brigham's kind of eccentric teachings and focused on Joseph Smith's revelation. The revelation says you have to bring your babies to the church, so that's what we should do. So there's a de facto 2 blessing policy. Yes, fathers can, if you want, bless at 8 days, but you have to bring the baby to church. Joseph F. Smith challenges that a bit, but essentially, for the first decades of the 20th century, fathers give their children to the ecclesiastics of the church, they bless it, but something happens with this renewed priesthood cosmology in which monogamy is now the normative institution, and the priesthood father becomes almost an ecclesiastical office. The way they describe baby blessings after World War II, they describe them such as it is the father's job to go to church and stake his claim on the child. He's announcing that this, everybody, is my baby. Mine. And so it's a tremendous lens to understand how fatherhood and priesthood in the 20th century are conflated. Now back to chapter 2, bouncing around a little bit. What do ceilings mean? So Nabab described how they created heaven on the anvil of the temple altar. What that requires is a measure of what Christian scholars call perseverance. This idea that in classical Reformed theology, perseverance is the idea that once saved and received grace, that you cannot totally fall from grace. And while in the 20th century, aspects of the temple liturgy were the receptacles of perseverance, in the 19th century, especially early 19th century, all ceilings persevered. Whether it was a ceiling between a spouse or between children. And that explains a little bit why we had to create ceilings between believers only. Adoption and polygamy complicating the issues. But as you can imagine, as the new temples came online and people were able to do proxy work more systematically, that there was a desire to be connected to one's parents and grandparents, regardless of whether or not they were church members, because they were good people. And there is a strain for decades. But perhaps in one of the most important revelations in the history of the church that nobody knows about, regardless if anyone knows about it or not, it's still one of the most important. Wilford Woodruff stands in general conference and says, "I've had a revelation, and I'm going to give it to you." And this is the revelation. We've been doing the best we could in the temple, but we got it wrong. We need to seal our ancestors to each other back as far as we can go. I should have been sealed to my father and my father to his father. That's the way it should have been done. But this creates a problem, because how can we rely on our ancestors to connect us to this heavenly network? What if they just are like, I'm sorry, I'm not interested. You Mormons are fine and all. I like coffee. Which wasn't an issue back then. It's wildly presentist, forgive me. So he says, how is this possible? And to quote him directly, he says, "There will be few, if any, who do not accept the gospel." So he basically established a Mormon universalism that is complicated in subsequent generations and subsequent strains of theology. This is expanded to the idea that all the faithful will ultimately receive the blessings of exaltation if they are faithful in this life. But getting them was a challenge. As soon as, it was a couple days before he announced this revelation publicly, Wilford Woodruff gathered his counselors together in the Quorum of the 12 for their regular meeting, and he says, "Guys, I got a revelation." And he explains it to them. And they were unanimous. Like, this is the best thing ever. This fixes everything. Celebrations ensue. George Buchanan, counselor in the first presidency, is like, "Man, this is awesome." He goes on 2 days later to be one of the champions of the revelation in General Conference and explaining it. But he says, "This is great, but there's still some problems we have here. What about the childless widow? My son David died and without posterity, and his wife is sealed to him, and now after the manifesto, who's going to want to marry her?" I mean, this is wildly sexist, of course, and it's hard to relate to, but it's a deep concern. What about all the single women? Now that we can't, just marry him off to some dude. And the depth of the crisis is evidenced by something he throws out. He's like, well, what if we have babies without marriage? And he writes in his journal, "I think I might have shocked some of my brethren. But I didn't mean to champion the idea or anything. I was just trying to see where it goes, because this is a big problem, folks. And I'm sure they were shocked, but they also considered it seriously. It didn't ultimately go there, but it is evidence of how challenged they were at that crucial moment, when everything changed and they didn't know how to find answers. Ultimately, what it was is Lorenzo Snow stands up and he's like, guys, my sister Liza R. Snow is amazing, and she will receive the whole shebang. So regardless of what happens, if you're faithful, you'll get all the blessings. And that has been kind of amplified and evolved in kind of interesting ways throughout the 20th century. But what it required is the sacrifice of perseverance on a couple of levels. The details more fully being explained in the book. So the anecdote that I opened up with, Zina D.H. Young's blessing, she gave hundreds of blessings a year. What do you do with that? Perhaps one of my favorite stories in chapter 4 is the folks down in Penguich Stake. And so there are not baby blessing texts, but healing and confinement blessing texts that women produced, mostly and primarily in the 20th century, all of which are in the 20th century. Linda Newell found one in Oakley, Idaho, dating to 1912, and that was a revolution. That development alone deserves the Nobel Prize of Mormon Studies. Chris and I found two more, a 1923 Salt Lake document, and actually three more. Penguich Stake mimeograph that was undated, and a Cannonville, Utah, 1906 blessing text. And what it is, it's essentially how to give, how women gave blessings, essentially. And it writes out the text of it. Beautiful documents. What was interesting was that the Penguich Stake mimeograph was nearly identical to the Cannonville 1906 document. And Chris and I kind of used what we had there. But a couple of years ago, I kind of put them on a map. Well, Penguich and Cannonville are close. What if they're in the same stake? And indeed they were. So the question then became, well, if Cannonville and Penguich had very similar texts, I wonder what the other ones did. And so, thanks be to Google Books, there's a 1906 stake register that gives you a list of all the things, all the words in Penguich Stake, and you go to the Church History Library and you look up the Relief Society minutes, and you find an Escalante and Tropic, Cannonville. The sisters in 1906 went to their minute book, went to the end, transcribed the text, and then cut out the last pages to say this is the end of the year. And they're all essentially the same text. There's transcription errors. Hannah Crosby was the stake president. She was just probably ordained maybe a year before. Her mother-in-law, Hannah Crosby, not awkward, was on her deathbed dying. When she was young, she received a patriarchal blessing that she should bless and anoint the sick. And because of her service, now we have this body of texts in 1906. But whereas the liturgy in the 19th century remained unwritten, there were specific rules. Do not write down the liturgy. Okay? That's not how we roll. In the 20th century, especially with the advent of the young missionary who was not trained liturgically by proximate example, we had to write down what to do. And whereas these sisters in Penguich Stake wrote this down, it was essentially geographically and temporally isolated, quickly forgotten. But what we see in the 20th century, that the missionary handbooks become the first receptacles of written liturgical texts. And they are all framed within the 20th century priesthood cosmology. So it's no surprise that when a young Thomas Monson receives such a handbook before going to war and has a friend that is sick and requests a blessing, that he goes to his bag, digs to the bottom, pulls it out, opens it up, reads the instructions, and gives the first blessing of his life. His friend is healed, and it's a foundational miracle. So the texts matter, and they're framed as priesthood ritual. And so it's consequently no surprise that with time, that becomes the dominant mode of ministry within the healing liturgy of the Latter-day Saints. I guess the last chapter I want to talk about, how are we doing on time?
You're good.
Okay. Is a chapter that's maybe even a little weird for my weird thing. So, we have chapter 5, we're talking about seer stones and astrology and what I call, or what many scholars call, the cunning folk traditions. So what are cunning folk? So fortunately, so a number of years ago, there was the salamander business, Mark Hoffman, seer stones, and a lot of early literature, Taylor on American treasure seeking, Quinn on Mormon in the magic worldview. But since then, and they did kind of path-breaking work, but since then, the scholars in the UK and Europe have really done amazing things. And so what you find is that cunning folk are a class of people that use the kind of the deprecated cosmologies of the past, which include seer stones and astrology and healing, blessing, but they are essentially the good folks. And these are traditions that were located within the church before the stripping of the altars, if you will. Right? So monks were the first people to categorize healing charms, seer stones, and then the Protestants were all like, "No, that's lame." They just like that. That's what they did, except with a British accent, so it probably sounded cooler. But these people existed in England and Europe up until the 20th century, right? And whereas in Europe there were explicit cunning folk, people that was their job, in America the traditions were diffuse and became folk practiced and not necessarily formalized, and is incorporated in Mormonism in interesting ways. My kind of a fundamental argument is that Mormonism did not essentially incorporate the traditions of the cunning folk into Mormonism. There's kind of interesting exceptions to that. What they did is they incorporated cunning folk themselves. People that believed in an open heaven, that defied the Protestant orthodoxy, and said, yeah, there's a place for you here. And then channeled their impulses into the orthoprax forms of the liturgy. And perhaps my favorite story of all is that of Sophia Romarell Russell. So James Talmage is a geologist, right? He's a smart guy, really smart. And before he was an apostle, he was a confidant of the First Presidency. So he's talking to the First Presidency, and he says, do you know what? I've heard about seer stones. I want to see some. So what do? They have Angus Cannon, who's the Salt Lake State president, take him around to the folks in Salt Lake. Right? Take him to two folks in particular, Edwin Rushton of White Horse Prophecy fame. He has a seer stone that he's had since Nauvoo. Claims it was once held by Moses, of all folks. He lost his ability to use it some decades earlier, but he still has it. And Sophia Romarell Russell, from the Isle of Jersey, convert, somewhere along the way, she picked up a seer stone which she says may have been found in Nauvoo originally. She travels to places. She went to Fillmore in 1890. The president of the High Priest Quorum went to her. He was just released from prison for a term of unlawful cohabitation and requests vision. Receives something that's very similar to a patriarchal blessing. Others go to her who they actually inscribe the blessings. They're fascinating. In Schofield, Utah. Does anyone know where Schofield is? It's still like, I've looked it up on the map 5 times and I still have a hard time remembering. It's like over the Wasatch Mountains a little bit. So the bishop there, like he had a question. So he's like, I'm going to call Sophia. And his counselors are like, you've got to be kidding me. What are you thinking, man? You're the bishop. You can't just ask a woman with a seer stone to give you an answer. He's incredulous. So he's like, you know what? I'm going to write to the First Presidency, and they're going to show you that it's totally fine. How do you think that went over, by the way?
Hey, she had the seer stone.
So Talmage takes her seer stone and Edwin's Russian seer stone to his lab. He subjects them to chemical and physical analysis. He writes in his journal, it's fascinating. He's like, you know what? I don't see visions or hear the voice of God. And you know what? These things are like, this one's a piece of glass and this one's quartz. There's nothing special about these. And then he goes on to editorialize. He's like, I guess, if the Lord wanted to turn a brick into a seer stone for his chosen prophet, I guess he can do that. And what's interesting, I edited it a little bit. If the Lord wants to make a piece of brick, a Urim and Thummim, right? And so he essentially creates the narrative for the 20th century where seer stones of the past. He goes back to Sophia, gives her a seer stone back, and is like, you cannot use this without the priesthood. Salt Lake Stake tries her, says, you can keep this, but you can only use it as directed by your priesthood officers. Which, I mean, it sounds kind of odd to us, but you have to realize that this is at the ascendance of what? The priesthood ecclesiology of the church. And, you know what? But it's not that different. Wilford Woodruff, when he was on his mission in the 1840s, presided over cases of seer stone use. And he gets up and he says, you know what? If you have somebody that's a healer, or if there's a teacher that can bless people, or you have a woman that can use a peepstone, this is, again, incorporating the people themselves into the church and channeling their orthopraxic forms. He's like, don't worry about it. Speaking to the leaders of the conference in England. You have to just remember, though, that the body is ruled by the head and not the feet. Okay? So he's proposing a place in Mormonism for people that are open to extravagance. But he's also proposing early on, and reiterating at the end of his life, that it has to be within the constraints of the ecclesiastical structure of the church, something that Joseph Smith himself began to do with the Hiram Page stone. So just in closing, I hope this gives you a little bit of the flavor. It's a little bit bouncing around, and I promise that the book is a lot more self-referentiated and makes more sense than what I just kind of pulled together. But if there's something that I can kind of exhort, right? The past, indeed, I mean, people say this past is foreign. But these are our people. And by understanding them, we gain a measure of empathy, even if we don't agree necessarily. Look, if someone broke out in glossolalia, my testimony meeting, I would be freaked out. Okay, so we don't necessarily have to like everything that we see in the past, but we can empathize with it and understand it and comprehend it and work towards integrating the narratives of priesthood and authority that structure our lives so that they can accommodate our intellectual and spiritual progenitors. And with that, I thank you all for coming.
Okay, questions? What, Jonathan?
So Oliver Cowdery's rod, or stick,
Yeah.
as it were, would you include that as comparable to the Hiram Page's stone or any of these other things, seer stones? I mean, this is something that Joseph Smith, obviously, I mean, the revelation comes down and says, go ahead and use it the way you've been using it.
Right. So it is part of the attenuated cunning folk tradition in the United States. So dowsing, right?
Yeah.
And if you go, I think Paul Reeve talks about teaching courses in which they incorporate folk belief. And inevitably there's somebody from rural Utah in one of his classes, and he can say, hey, is anybody, dowsing? And they're like, oh yeah, totally douse. Don't do that. There was a cave, one of the largest discoveries of a cave in Montreal in recent memory, this last fall. In the news articles, it was found by cave explorers using a dowsing rod. Now look, I'm a chemist, okay? I've got a PhD in Enlightenment science. But this is entirely within the tradition of the cunning folk seer stone usage that is present in America on the fringes of society.
Of interest to you would be the use of these rods in southern Utah, well actually not southern Utah, mid-Utah, to find oil and gas.
Oh yeah.
By PhD geologists.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah. Who had as much success as the guys with the technical instruments. Now,
Our technical instruments are crap.
that's I can see it.
How do you feel about it?
I'm a skeptic as you too.
No, but look, I love this stuff. I mean, I'm just kind of joking around a little bit, right? Because I have a deep love and I hope empathy for the practitioners that I write about. But I have to be kind of a little snarky too.
Yeah, you got it.
I thought I saw a hand over here. Sure.
I really am interested in the Cosmological Priesthood for the Black Priesthood ban. That's a provocative thing to me. Having not read your book or not knowing a ton about it, it seems like the logical conclusion for severing a node that is somebody's sort of cosmological fraternal brother, where the relationship is heavenly, is pacifism. I'm not sure that kind of translates in the sources that I've seen. I'm just curious, is there sort of this rhetoric about not killing people at all? Does race run in here?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's clearly racial, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Brigham Young does not say necessarily enlightened things about black people, right? That's a fair statement. Although he has good relationships with black people. And he does have, he's not a cruel man. But whenever he talks about the priesthood and temple restriction, it's in context of this thing. And it's not just like he killed his brother. People kill each other all the time and their kids aren't banned from the priesthood or temple. Right? It's always within this framework. So the question is then, so if we just throw the cosmological priesthood out the window and just say, let's forget that for a moment, what does the story mean? Why is Brigham Young using this story to frame the restriction? And it's really hard to come up with anything good. And so we just skip over it and say, we actually don't know because it's incomprehensible. This doesn't make any sense. Does that jibe?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks.
So I just have
I have a clarifying question first about the cosmological priesthood.
Yep.
Is that just the way they referred to the priesthood in the temple, or is that sort of, is all priesthood back then?
Okay, so it's really quick. They didn't refer to the cosmological priesthood, right?
Yeah.
So that's just my little thing. And look, all models fail. Okay, I wish Dr. Peck were here. We use models to understand systems that are real, but the models themselves aren't real. So I guess what I would say is that in Nauvoo, in the immediate post-Nauvoo era, the cosmological priesthood influences everything. Like if you read Brigham Young's sermons, they're saturated in it. And he doesn't make the distinction, right? He doesn't make the distinction between priesthood of church and priesthood of temple. But he's clearly talking in ways that are inflected by this temple priesthood concept, right? And so then what do? Right? So we come in and we try to make sense of it all. And so my distinctions are consequently somewhat artificial because he's blurring the lines, and it's really hard to get into his mind and the other people's minds. But what we can see are trends over time, if that makes sense, and how these languages are used. So for example, Brigham Young will say, the priesthood is a perfect government. And so we would say today that in the modern catechism, the creation was done through priesthood power. So if you cracked open any of the modern catechisms, it would say priesthood is the power of God and the power that God used to create the universe and the earth. That's a direct paraphrase quote. Such thing exists. Brigham Young would say, priesthood is the organizational structure of heaven, and angels used chemistry to create the world. So you can kind of see the difference. Priesthood, definitionally being the power of God, doesn't happen until the 20th century, right? And so Brigham Young is constantly talking on one side about these cosmological aspects of priesthood, but in his day job, he's ordaining and setting apart and releasing priesthood officers in the church. And so what our job then has to do is like figure out how they relate to each other if they do. And I'm proposing a model, and maybe someone looks at it and says, it's more complicated than that. And it may be. Is that fair?
Yeah. And then I just had a follow-up question. How you were saying that that there was a story of Cain that was told that sort of took black people away from the priesthood, and they later came up with different justifications, maybe fence-sitters or something like that. At the very beginning, how you mentioned how women in the temple were initially referred to as the priesthood as well. I was wondering if there were like stories that justifications to sort of distance the priesthood from women, maybe like Eve took the apple or something like that.
Yeah, I think some people have tried to do work like that. But, I mean, it's fascinating. So in the 20th century, Artis has found this great sermon from William Critchlow Jr. in the mid-50s. So by this time, priesthood definitionally has become the power of God. Okay? That's what priesthood is, the power of God. And he gets up and he says, it's the power of God that specifically excludes women. Okay? Now that has some dissonance with what we hear recently, but it's precisely how in mid-20th century church leaders framed it, right? And then he goes on to say, but we actually don't really know why. So I think what happens is while the cosmological priesthood requires the integration of women to be coherent, because the 20th century cosmology is an expansion from the ecclesiology, which is de facto male, they just read it that way because that's the way it is. They start with that, and so that's the expansion is consequently all male. And then the question becomes why, and a lot of people have tried to figure that out. I've got nothing.
Can you talk about Emma Smith and her place in this cosmological priesthood? She's ordained in 1830, DNC 25. She's she's to be ordained, or she is ordained, and then 1842 she's confirmed that ordination and becomes the head of the Relief Society. And then with Joseph Smith, she becomes she's co-ordained with Joseph as kind of the presiding couple of the anointed quorum.
There's no such thing as the anointed quorum in Nauvoo.
Okay, well, clarify and tell me where she is and how do you see her in all this formation?
Okay, I'm just being a little snarky there. So the anointed quorum is a term that Thomas Bullock comes up with in Utah to describe this group of people that participates in the temple liturgy, which they refer to themselves sometimes as the quorum. So it was fair, but I'm just being snarky. So Emma is complicated. So first of all church offices are, people assume church office through ordination, okay? And whether it's a priesthood office that they're being ordained to or a non-priesthood office in the church, it's by ordination until the late 19th century. So that's the first thing we have to realize. Ordination to an office in the church does not equate to ecclesiastical priesthood office. That's the first bit. So Emma is ordained to an office in the church that is essentially something very similar to a deacon or a teacher. The language of the Revelation uses the language from the Articles and Covenants, right?
Yeah.
And from the outside, if someone were reading it, they would say, this looks very much like a Methodist exhorter, her job. Okay? But then in Nauvoo, we have the expansion with the Relief Society, and so there's a new ecclesiastical office, the Relief Society in the church. And that precedes, now, you're probably going to want to talk to Maxine, because she's going to disagree with me a little bit.
Right there.
What I would say then is, so there's this ecclesiastical office, and it has an ecclesiastical tradition within the church. And I would say that the temple, cosmological priesthood, is not coterminous with ecclesiastical office. Okay? They're separate. And so Emma is ordained a priestess in the temple quorum, the temple group. And Joseph is ordained a priest, a promise that is extended to all participants of the liturgy. There's a sticking point, right? And that's that she hates polygamy, right? And so after Joseph Smith dies, she's already disaffected from polygamy, and the Quorum of the 12 are ascendant, and Brigham Young is like, blames her, and consequently cuts her out of the cosmological priesthood. So you look at who is a parent for sealing. So Hiram Smith receives, so he has his temple work done in Nauvoo. So they redo his temple work in Nauvoo. They seal his children to him, his wives to him. Joseph Smith, Emma, no.
Go.
Yeah. So Joseph Smith actually has one child sealed to him in the 19th century, and that's David, and he's born posthumously. Emma does not participate in the temple liturgy, and consequently, the Quorum of the 12 act as biological alternatives to the Smith family in the construction of heaven, if that makes sense.
Interesting.
So you're saying Emma never received her endowments?
No, she did while Joseph Smith lived.
Right.
But when the Nauvoo temple is finished, they redo the liturgy for everybody.
Oh.
Okay, actually, they redo it a couple
Is there
times.
anyone else we know of in that situation besides Emma?
That didn't have it redone?
Right.
There's a couple. There's a couple that were like, I'm done with this.
Also, nothing that Brigham Young decided these people couldn't do anything like that.
Yeah, but I mean, Emma, whether Brigham wouldn't allow it or Emma didn't want to, I think it's probably the same deal. There was not, they weren't particularly happy with each other.
Mr. Stapley,
Yeah.
what other projects you got on the horizon?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm interested in these sorts of topics, so I haven't exhausted the list of rituals in the church. I think that the temple liturgy is, that's its own thing. But there's a lot outside of that still needs to be written. I think concepts of priesthood, like the keys of the priesthood, or something that is a rich vein that's untapped. Canon law, from like referencing kind of the Roman Catholic scholarly tradition that I kind of crib a little bit in liturgical studies towards canon law, I think is a useful framework for understanding the development of Mormon jurisprudence. Nate Oman, sorry. You'll think it's stupid anyways. Please.
With the Reformation, we know that people were rebaptized. Did people go in and have their endowments redone, or there was none of that going on? See anything of that?
Yeah, so there's particular cases. So Joseph Smith redoes everybody's temple initiation and endowment when Hiram converts to the plan. They are redone in Nauvoo. They are redone in the endowment house. So yeah, I mean, yeah. So they do kind of renew, but it's only a core group of people. It's not common by any stretch of the imagination. Whereas rebaptism,
you found records of that?
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Whereas rebaptism is ubiquitous.
Yeah, that was right.
Yeah. Dozens of times in a lifetime.
So I'm struggling with a question.
Please.
That relates both to the cosmological priesthood and to women. So I'm not sure if I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question in a way that makes sense. And
fair.
So I've decided I'm just going to talk for a few seconds. And
please.
Maybe you can tease my question out of this. So when I think about the way that you've described the cosmological priesthood, I think we're all familiar with an Aaronic priesthood, a Melchizedek priesthood, and you've introduced this third kind of priesthood. But I don't know if you intend for it to be separate from these other two kinds of priesthood.
I think they're categorically different.
So you would say that there is a cosmological priesthood, what you're calling a cosmological priesthood, that is unique to the temple.
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything...
But it's categorically different. It's a heuristic. It's not a category of priesthood authority.
Right. Well, and you would also say, I guess, that Aaronic and Melchizedek are bureaucratic.
Right.
And the cosmological priesthood is something else.
Yeah.
So, is there anything beyond custom and tradition that would prevent a woman from receiving the priesthood?
No.
Okay.
No, but I mean, by the priesthood, you mean by the ecclesiastical priesthood of the church?
Any of those two kinds of bureaucratic and the...
So, I mean, that heuristic is useful for understanding 19th century Mormonism. I'm not sure how useful it is of understanding Mormonism today.
Right.
So there are different ways of understanding the temple cosmology today. So I'm not sure that is a useful question of whether or not women can, because in as much as it could, it requires women to exist.
Right.
So the cosmological priesthood can't exist without the incorporation of both men and women.
Right.
Okay, so it's a presupposition of its existence. As far as, I mean, look, someone asked me a question about, some time ago, about, what's possible within our tradition, and it's essentially whatever the church leaders decide, right? Now, would I prefer that they acted in a historically informed manner that was cognizant of all the interesting aspects of our history? That'd be my preference. But who am I? Right? They don't ask me advice. It'd be cool if they did. But I think this is, so at the end of the book, there's a little spiel where I contrast Cardinal Ratzinger and Holland at Harvard. David, thank you. And how they describe essentially their respective traditions, essentially the same, where there's a living tradition. Now, what the seeds of that tradition are, the various faiths, is completely different. but the fact that they are living organisms and essentially ecological in nature are very similar. And I think we have a lot to learn in the maturing of our faiths from our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters.
So we just discount Revelation? Is that what we do here? It doesn't matter?
I don't think I said that at all.
Yeah, I know you're dismissing Revelation, and both of you guys have got this idea that priesthood and everything evolved in the mind of Joseph Smith and maybe Brigham Young and maybe other guys.
No. So,
in the absence of...
But no, I don't think that's fair. So let me, because I have to stop you. It evolved. Okay, that's clear.
It evolved.
Okay?
Okay.
If you disagree that it evolved, then I will have to...
I agree that it evolved.
Okay, so we both agree that it evolved.
Yes.
I am describing how it evolved. Now, I'm going to take a step back and put on my believer's hat. And heck yeah, I believe in Revelation. I'm a believer, right? But right now, I'm going to put my scholar hat back on and be like, it doesn't matter. That's not a question that's useful to ask.
Yeah.
Okay? The useful question to ask is, what's happening? What is happening here? How do we understand it? To like invoke Stephen Taysom. What work is this ritual doing in the community that performs it? What is it doing? And I think I'm a little worked up because I think an accusation to say that you guys discount Revelation or anything, it rubs me the wrong way. That's not a question my book can answer or any book can answer. Was Joseph Smith inspired? I talk about Joseph Smith's revelation as an assumed presupposition for the discussion. It was a revelation. Now, whether you believe that revelation came from God or his own genius is your business. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Let's do one more.
Maxine?
So I wanted to get back to your comments to Gary and Claire and their questions, and then kind of hone in on a particular issue of how I absolutely agree actually with the answer you gave to Claire. And distinguishing Emma's ordinations from any sort of male priesthood. She was ordained to various church offices. But the sticking point here is how you and I maybe differ on how we use the word ecclesiastical. In your three categories, your model, which I love, and your book, which I love, it's such an important, rigorous contribution to this struggle that many of us have been engaged in trying to sort out priesthood and authority and gender. But in your three categories of authority, which overlap very much with how I've mapped it as well, in the liturgical authority, the priestly authority, and the ecclesiastical authority. What I find interesting, and what I want to hear you just say a little bit more about, is that on the one hand, you differentiate the ecclesiastical from the priestly in your categories, but on the other hand, you kind of fall back and tend to conflate ecclesiastical with male priesthood office. In a way. And that's a weird tension for me, and I want you to kind of address that. Also, just with this whole issue of the ecclesiastical, I tend to see the ecclesiastical, I kind of conflate that with your category of liturgical. I sort of see church offices, church callings, elect lady, president of this or that. I see that as lay ecclesiastical, and I see priesthood or priestly as something different. But anyway, get to that tension of, because I see you kind of doing both. I see you separating the ecclesiastical from the priestly, but then when you talk about ecclesiastical, you tend to conflate it with male offices, Melchizedek and Aaronic.
So I guess my answer would be is that I'm not the one doing the conflating.
Oh.
And so, and it's not the reader that's doing the conflating either. So what I try to do is I try to say that there are activities that require liturgical authority. So someone saying a prayer in sacrament meeting, you have to be invited to do that. You're given authority to do that. And women, for the majority of the 20th century, lacked the requisite authority to do so. Okay? So that is a measure of liturgical authority to participate in the liturgy of the church in a certain way. Then there is ecclesiastical office, which is a particular calling, which in our modern vernacular, an office of the church structure, in its entity as a church, ecclesia. And then there is the temple, cosmology. And I guess I would say that priesthood overlaps on those things in a dynamic fashion. And such that in the beginning of the church, all ecclesiastical offices were priesthood offices. Okay? And in the 20th century, there's a concentration of liturgical authority in the priesthood bureaucracy. So I guess I would say that I use those kind of as static regions, and that priesthood, how Mormons have used priesthood, floats over those in interesting and dynamic ways. That makes sense.
Yeah, okay. And you also mentioned, which I agree with, that women are given all three types of authority, the liturgical, ecclesiastical, and priestly. But again, I guess as a final question to throw at you, where would you put, well, maybe this is too complex of a question, but given that they did receive all types of authority, they did receive all types of authority, and you and I completely agree on that, where would you place their ordination if you were to summarize or try to answer that question? Are Mormon women ordained? You know, some people want Mormon women to be ordained. I've been saying they've been ordained for forever, since 1830. Where would you place? Would you basically say then that they're just ordained to all three of those categories, or how would you place their ordination?
I think the people that generally ask that question today presume a modern cosmology, and what they're saying is, can women be ordained to priesthood offices within the Melchizedek and Aaronic priesthood as constituted in the general handbooks of the church? That's what they're asking. It doesn't. I think that question is almost entirely foreign to the work I'm doing, and so maybe even talking past each other a little bit. I don't know that it's even reconcilable. Maybe it is. So with that, thank you very much for coming.